Gracias, Wakalisi, Gabriann Abby Hall, Iwaskani. Hello, my name is Gabriann Hall, my nickname's Abby, and I'm from the Klamath tribes. And I want to thank you for coming today. Usually I walk around a lot, but I'm going to try and stay in one spot. But it helps me get out my nervous energy. I want to thank you for coming. This talk today is titled Truth, Reckoning, and Healing, A Story of Indian Boarding Schools. And I make sure I title it A Story because there is no one story. Any Native American person or descendant of Native blood has their own story. And so I always want to make sure that I make it clear that I do not speak on behalf of all people, all Native people, on behalf of my tribe or my family. We have a shared history, and then we also have the individual and tribal story. So I just always want to make sure that you know that there's never one way to be Native or one way to experience this history. And that's important to realize. And as Native people, the first place the way we kind of identify ourselves is where we're from. And this image is of my parents' backyard right here. This is called Council Grove. This is where the Treaty of the Lakes was signed in 1864. And this, I tell my parents, we live on sacred ground because we get to look out over those treaty grounds. And I am an enrolled member of the Klamath tribes, and that's where I come from, my connection to land. My connection to people is I am the daughter of Lawrence and Ann Hall, and I am the granddaughter of Marilyn Mitchell Hall. And when I teach this history, it comes from a place of passion and of personal perspective. This is an image that we actually just found last week. And this is my grandma at the age of 12 being enrolled in Canyonville Bible Academy. And after she attended Canyonville Bible Academy, she was separated from her two younger sisters, sent across the country to attend Haskell Indian School in Lawrence, Kansas. Her two younger sisters were sent down to attend Stewart Indian School in Nevada. And so when I speak about the boarding school history, I want to give credit and recognize the ancestors as well as the descendants, because this had generational impacts on all Native people that can still be seen today. And the boarding school motto started in about 1606. This is a quote from the Virginia Company. And basically it's saying it's okay to take the children from their parents and bring them up and educate them. 170 years later, founding father Thomas Jefferson goes ahead and he says, we would never cease pursuing them with war while one remained on the face of the earth. Indians had to be civilized or exterminated. To become civilized, Indians had to give up their hunting way of life and transform themselves into farmers. Indians as farmers would not be allowed to remain in the borders. Indians as Indians would not be allowed to remain within the borders of civilized society. And this is 1776. Thomas Jefferson's goals finally came about over 100 years later. And that was with the Dawes Act in 1887. That was when it became federal policy to take children away through boarding schools. And this quote from a native Ojibwe author says, this new phase of federal Indian policy was known as assimilation. And as bad as the years of warfare and treaty making had been, assimilation would be immeasurably worse. That's a really hefty quote because we know that open warfare and removal, we know about the Trail of Tears where 1/4 of natives died. We know about any natives who refused to remain on the reservation were being hunted down and either murdered or sent to Indian territory to be jailed for the rest of their lives. And he's saying that assimilation's worse. And I think you will agree that he is right. And so when people say, oh, the boarding schools have been going on for 150 years, that's not accurate. It just became federal policy in 1887. We can clock it all the way back to 1606. So I want you to think, when we think about Native people in the boarding experience, it's not just one generation, it's generational. And the way they achieve this goal under the Dawes Act is, one, the boarding schools. If you take away the children and you raise them up differently, you break down the future generations. And that was done with intention and purpose. The second was allotment. And when people think of the Dawes Act, this is what they think of. Because during this piece of legislation, 90 million acres went from tribal domain into public domain. So those signs that you see in history books, free land, that's where this free land came from, was the Dawes Act. And then the least known of this legislation is called the Indian offenses. And I believe the reason it's the least known is because this was the cultural genocide. And I don't use that term lightly. It became illegal to practice ceremony. You could not sing, dance, drum, or do any of those things. So one of the things that was the most outrageous at this time was a ceremony that a lot of native tribes would practice upon the death. It's called a giveaway. And many tribes based a person's esteem not on how much you had, but on how much you could give away. And so upon a person's death, all their belongings would be given away. So I want you to think about that. If we took that one cultural value and we put it into our modern day society, instead of how much we could accumulate, that our esteem within our community was based on how much we give. And that was outlawed. And that you were going to be jailed if you had a celebration upon the death and gave away the dead person's things. And so this was known as the Indian offenses. And again, you couldn't come together and dance and sing or practice such things as a giveaway upon death. But the place we're going to narrow in on today is the boarding schools. And this is a somewhat frequent type of, I'll call it propaganda that they would use. They would have the savage coming in and the civilized going out of the boarding schools. And this is a young Navajo man, but this was the normal thing they would do. They'd actually sell these pictures to make money for the boarding schools. And to be considered a person, you had to be a certain way. Indian kids were sent to boarding schools to become non-Indian. And the way they did this was first they removed them from their communities, because there was schools, they were called reservation schools, right there on the reservation. And what the federal government found was as long as the children were still within the community, they still practiced the lifeways. They hunt, gathered, they fished, they did those sorts of things. And they also still spoke their language. So in order to fully assimilate them, we have to remove them from their family and their tribe. And then once we remove them, we will teach them a skill set and English. And then lastly, we will return them forever changed. And so imagine being taken and going into a boarding school and you're fluent in your native language. You spend, let's say, 10 years at the boarding school and you return back to your reservation. You can no longer communicate with your grandparents because they only speak your tribal language and now you only speak English. My grandma was a fluent speaker and taught not a single word of her language to any of her children or grandchildren. And so that shows kind of coming back and just not fitting. Not only did they not fit within society, internally they no longer knew who they were. And the first school opened in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1979. And it was opened by a military man named Major Richard Pratt. And he ran this school like the military. This picture right here is of some Apache who were rounded up. This was about the time that Geronimo was surrendering. And so these Apache children were rounded up and sent to Carlisle. And this is what they would look like within weeks of being at Carlisle. And I usually make a joke here, even though it's not a laughing matter, but you'll notice they're in their traditional clothes here. And here they're in uniforms. And I want you to think about what it would do to the psyche. The last time you saw a military uniform, they were hunting down your family, gathering you up and removing you. And within a day or two of being within the school, you are now dressed like your enemy. You are now dressed like the people who have forced oppression on you. And so the joke I tell is I am a beaver. I have 3 degrees from OSU. And if I was to lose a Civil War bet and told I had to wear a U of O sweatshirt, I would be highly insulted. And I know you guys are docs and nothing's wrong with that, but just imagine. So if you all who are docs had to wear a OSU sweatshirt, and we're not even your oppressor, we're just your rival. But you know, it'd be uncomfortable. I wouldn't like that. That's what I have to do if I lose a bet. But on a much grander scale, that is what is happening to children. And so I cannot even begin to comprehend what that felt like to these young kids. But that's what happened. The motto of the boarding school was, kill the Indian, save the man. And I'm going to take you through a scenario. And when I do set scenarios, I fully understand that we will never be able to comprehend what happened. But I think an exercise in empathy kind of puts us in the footsteps of what these kids were going through. And so I want you to pretend that we have a roaring bonfire right here. And somebody comes in with a gun, and at gunpoint, they take everything that we have brought with us, our cell phone, our purses, and we are all told to put on white jumpsuits. And you have to sit here and watch everything that you brought today burn. I want you to think about what was forcefully removed from you and what you would be saddest to sit and watch burn. I usually have people point to like a wedding ring or something, but that connection has now been broken. And that's just a physical connection of what you have on. And that's what would happen to Native students. The very first thing that would happen when they got to the boarding school is they would have their clothing stripped. And these were not clothes that you bought at Macy's. These were clothes that were made for you by family members that loved you. And you know, it may be something that was bestowed upon you. Like frequently they would have maybe a feather in their hair. And all of that would be taken from you, and you would be forced into uniforms. And so what that had to feel like to see something that you loved given to you by somebody that cared about you, intentionally taken and destroyed. That connection is broken. The second connection that would be broken would be Native children would have their hair cut. And Native people believe that our hair holds power. And you only cut your hair when you are in mourning. And so there are stories, because all of these schools had barber shops. And so these children would be taken, and they wouldn't speak the language, and they wouldn't know why their hair was cut. They would just know that everybody was getting their hair cut. And so in their young minds, they assumed that that meant that there had been great loss and great death. They say you could hear the wails of the children echo down the halls from the barber shop. And this isn't uncommon. We just went through our first pandemic. At this time, whole tribes and families were being wiped out. So it wasn't unrealistic for them to think that we're all having our hair forcefully cut. Something must have happened to our family and our people. And so they would have their hair cut. And I mean, I just think about the decisions we make about our hair today before we showed up here. It's the way we express ourselves. And to have that forcefully removed from you, even if you don't associate a strength or a value with your hair, the choice is no longer yours. And you're going to have that cut off. And that's what happened to Native kids. The last thing I want you to do is to think about your personal lives and your friends and your family and your dogs and your cats. And when children were taken to these schools, in my research, a Klamath tribal member was taken as young as 6 months. And they were held in the schools until the federal government decided that they could be let out at the age of 18 to 20. And when they were originally taken, they would not go home for spring break, Christmas break. You stayed at the school until you were released. So imagine you were taken at 5 and you were released at 20. That's a 15-year gap. I want each of you to think in your head, if you were forcefully removed from this room at gunpoint, which the children were rounded up at gunpoint, and taken, and you were held captive for 10 years, who would not be here when you got back? Who would you never be able to say goodbye to? We are grown adults that struggle with comprehending that. You know, there's probably a list of people within a 10-year gap that would not be here. And that was what children had to deal with. You didn't know who was going to be gone when you came back. And that happened generation after generation. And this is just a short scenario of things that we can never comprehend. But this was the reality for Native children. When they also arrived at the school, there would be a blackboard and there would be names on it. And you would go and you would pick a name. And so, you know, a Native name that's bestowed upon you because you earned it, or they feel that there's spiritual meaning in it through ceremony, that name's given to you. You now became John. And so associate, what does your name mean to you? How would it feel to be called by something different, especially against your will? And then something else, I think there's a couple of key points I want you to take from this talk, but one is that everything was done with intention and purpose. They would intentionally send students far from their homes. So using my family as an example, why would they separate the 3 sisters and send 1 to Lawrence, Kansas, and 2 to Carson City, Nevada? We know that we gather strength from our family. Listen to any circuit court judge, the number one thing they want to do is keep families together because that's been proven that it's a strength. They would intentionally separate siblings so that they could weaken them. They could have sent all 3 of those girls to Chemawa, up by Salem. Yet they chose to separate them and send them across the country. One last scenario. Let's pretend that there's a Warm Springs tribal member and they are traveling from Madras up to the great trading grounds at Celilo Falls, right up by Biggs Junction. And let's pretend that a 12-year-old kid gets separated from the group. When they're going to fishing camp, this 12-year-old gets separated along the journey. And so the 12-year-old either has to make it back to Warm Springs or up to Biggs Junction. How many of you think, 100 years ago, a 12-year-old could have made that journey and eventually ended up in one of those spots? How many of you feel confident, yeah, they could have handled that? They were raised at a young age to know how to live off the land, how to navigate. They just had to find the Deschutes River and they knew their way. They had to look at the mountains and they would know. I feel confident that my 7-year-old could probably find her way to Fort Klamath. And she's 7 and she doesn't have all these traditional ways, But they knew how to navigate the land. They knew how to survive off the land. But let's take that same 12-year-old and stick him in Phoenix, Arizona. Would he survive? No. As Native people, we gather strength just from the land and from our land specifically. And they would break that connection intentionally. That's why they would send them across the country. And so things were done with emphasis and purpose. The second boarding school in the nation was opened right here in Oregon, and that was up in Forest Grove on the grounds of Pacific University. That's where Pacific University is today. The school was opened for 5 years before it was relocated down the road just outside of Salem and Chemawa. And these are some advertising photos, and it shows the skill set that Natives would learn. And this was one of the positives that came out of boarding schools, was actually learning a skill, such as one's learning carpentry, and then they're making shoes, but they would learn blacksmithing and those sorts of skills. And here's another image of the brand new schools that were being built down in Chemawa. And the children built the schools. So imagine if I took an elementary, middle school, and a high school class, and I said, okay, Bend High just passed the levy, or the Deschutes County passed the levy, all you kids go build the school. That would never go today. There's like child labor laws. These kids built this school, and they built this school in February. And they worked from sunup to sundown, and then they would stay the night in a tent in February. There were multiple Klamath students here at this time. And guess what? They repeatedly died because they were literally being worked to death. This is the standard across the board kind of schedule that children kept. And so everything within the school was taken care of by the students. So, we think farm to table is like a really hip term. They practiced farm to table way before it was hip. They were, let's say you had a mule to plow the grounds. They were in charge of taking care of the mule, feeding the mule, harvesting the food, repairing the shoes on the mule, and then preparing the food to go on the table. They all had extra duties. And so when my children started kindergarten, the poor little things would go from 8 to 2, and they would have to come home and take a 2-hour nap. They were 5 or 6 years old. But if they were in boarding school, they were up at 5:20, and going to bed at 8:45. My 10-year-old is in bed between 7:30 and 8. And she does not work this schedule. So this is what they did to children. And they have statistics that have come out in the last year. A bunch of Apache children at a school down in Phoenix made over 150,000 bricks. They sawed over 70,000 yards of lumber. This is the type of work that children were doing to run these schools. And there was opposition across the board in Indian country to these schools. I never want people to say, oh, the parents didn't love their children and they just let them go. That's not the case. And this image speaks to this. These are some Plains tribes, and they're in teepees, and they refused to let their children go, and so they followed them to the school. There was 8 Hopi leaders who did not want their children to be released and tried to hide the children, and they were jailed at Alcatraz. This is a direct resource, a primary resource related to the Klamath tribes. And it's Richard Pratt, the founder of Carlisle, and he's speaking to the Klamath Indian agents. And he says, those in opposition to sending children to Carlisle need to be warned to desist from such non-progressive interference. So you could be jailed, or the treaty rights, which were rations and doctors, would be pulled if you refused to send your children. Up the road at Warm Springs, they told everybody to bring their kids in for vaccines, rounded them up and took the children. And so I never want people to think that these children were given up, because they weren't. Sometimes the conditions may be so harsh that the parents may assume that at least if they went to school, they would be fed. They would be fed 3 meals a day. They would be safer there. Or there were other natives who believed that, this is the way of the future. If we're going to be progressive, we need to teach our children English. They need to become assimilated. And so that was also a mindset. But at no point was it a choice not to send your children. And so by 1926, 83% of Indian children are in federally run boarding schools. And this is the first class that is sent to Carlisle from the Klamath tribes. And this class showed up at Carlisle, 9 of them, on May 16th, 1900. And I take great pride in this. This is another primary source. And this is Major Pratt writing back to the Klamath Indian agent, and he's not happy. What he says is the whole party has proven to be the most unsatisfactory of any party received at the school in recent years. The Kirk boys, who were the worst of the lot. We are getting the one, Selden, who remains here, into some shape now. I'm a cousin of the Kirk boys. And I am happy that these Klamath kids give Pratt a run for his money. I feel a sense of pride in that. But at the same time, I'm like, Pratt was an evil guy. What happened? What's he doing when he says he has Selden firmly in hand now? What does that mean? My dad calls him Uncle Selden. What happened to Uncle Selden? I don't know. What I know is that here's a picture. Right over here is their dad, Jesse, who was originally a proponent of the boarding schools. He's like, this is the way of the future. We're going to do this. And then here is Selden, and this is his older brother, Clayton. This young man right here is a Modoc, and his name's Joe Ball. And these are both from the Carlisle archives. And I don't know what happened, but I know that Joe Ball and Clayton ran from Carlisle. And I know they made it 250 miles. That's a good run. If they were at Chemawa, they would have made it home. They were still over 2,500 miles from home. And so when I say things were done with intention and purpose, if you place them on the other side of the United States and they run, they're probably not going to make it. And I also know how these boarding schools were set up and how bad the punishments were. Every single boarding school had a jailhouse. And then they also had handcuffs where they would cuff children. And I go through my PowerPoints in the morning before I give them, just to refresh my memory and look at my notes. And 2 years ago, I was going through this PowerPoint and I got to this slide and my 5-year-old daughter was sitting next to me. And she glances over and she looks at my computer. And she said, "What is that?" And my heart started beating fast, and I couldn't really catch my breath. And I didn't want to tell her what they were, because she's a child. She doesn't need to know this stuff. And I said, "Oh, they're handcuffs." And I went to flip to the next slide. And she said, why do they look like that? Why are they so small? And again, I didn't want to tell her. I said, they're for kids. And she looks at me, so now she's paying attention. And she said, "Who would want to handcuff little kids?" And I just said, "Bad people," and I slipped on to the next slide. And I just sat there, and it dawned on me, they were made for her. They were made for a 5-year-old little baby to wear. And they had to be made specially for little kids to wear. And just by the grace of God and the privilege that we were sitting in that morning, she didn't have to wear them. But my grandparents and their grandparents had to wear these kind of handcuffs. And they were made with intention and purpose. And so there's those little moments where I really recognize my privilege of not wanting to tell my child this true and accurate history. And I have the ability not to. But the reality is that generations of our people lived that. And that was their reality. And they didn't have a privilege to gloss over it or not handle it at the time. And every once in a while, I just get a punch to the gut like that when I talk about this history. And I think a lot of times we try to place the history a long time away. It's like, oh, that was a long time ago. That was generations ago. Or it was physically a long ways away. But I want you to know that that did not happen a long ways away. And that's why I'm going to bring us back to Chemawa here in Oregon. And this is one of those advertisement photos. And this is a recruiting class out of Spokane. These are the Spokane Indians. And this was considered a really good recruiting class. And one of the reasons this was such a top recruiting class was this lady right here. Her name is Matricia Mott. And it was considered a good recruit, not only because they got quite a few kids, but because Matricia is the daughter of Chief Mott. So anybody that knows about the Pacific Northwest, there were a couple of chiefs who refused to stay on their reservations. We had the Modocs 2 hours south of here, and then we had a man named Joseph who wouldn't go to the Lapwai Reservation. And so what the federal government decided to do was to go in and recruit the children of leadership. So that way they could hold them hostage against their parents and try to gain their parents doing as they were told. And so that's why this was such a good recruiting class, because we have the daughter of the chief here. And so this pitch photo, the second photo, was taken 7 months later after this. These children weren't even taken to the school. They were taken directly down to downtown Portland and had their picture taken. But what differences do you notice between the two photos? There's fewer. Within 2 months, or within 7 months, 2 of these children are dead, one of which is Matricia Mott. Within 5 years, it's 7 years, 5 of these children are dead. The death within the schools was catastrophic. And this is from the Indian agent at Forest Grove Indian School. He says, "It has been said that to educate an Indian is to sign his death warrant. Yet still it was deemed that education was more important than literal life. Indian children were 6 times more likely to die in childhood at boarding schools than the rest of the children in America. Within a 5-year span at Chemawa, 319 children ran away." And so you would think that somebody would be like, there must be something wrong with these schools. The fact that they have jails, child handcuffs, and they all have cemeteries. Let's look into it. But that didn't happen. And even when they did look into it and found out how bad they were, still nothing was done. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit. But when I started looking into these boarding schools, we were writing curriculum for the state of Oregon. Because in 2016, the state did an amazing thing. They decided people in Oregon should learn Oregon tribal history. And then they did a second amazing thing. And instead of being like, okay, we'll write your history for you, like has happened since time immemorial, they said, hey, Native people, write your history and tell us what happened. You have no idea how empowering that is for people who have never had that privilege. And so I was on the team that we were going to write this Senate Bill 13 history. And so we knew we wanted to tell the story of the boarding schools because it's just fundamentally so linked to education, and it's not known. It's not widely known. And so I was researching this, and I knew that a researcher, her name's Eva Gugamos from Pacific University, was writing a book. And so I got an online meeting with Eva, and she was very nice and very helpful. We talked for a couple hours, and I was hanging up the Zoom call from her. And I said, hey, Eva, is there anything that you wanted to tell me and I forgot to ask? And she said, I've been meaning to talk to somebody from your tribe because I'm wondering if you know what you guys want to do with the bodies. And I was like, what? I'm a history teacher. I'm researching curriculum. What do you mean, bodies? And she said there's several bodies that belong to the Klamath tribes up in the Chemawa Cemetery. And I was just like, this is way above my pay grade. My pay grade there was volunteer. And I'm like, this needs to go to tribal council. And I knew we had a lot of work in this project to go. So I just kind of had this weight hanging on my head because I wanted to write a letter to tribal council and ask them what to do with these bodies. And we were wrapping up the project, and we just happened to be wrapping up the project in the summer of 2020. And in the summer of 2020 was the bootleg fire. And it burned over 400,000 acres, half of which was our former reservation. We were coming off the pandemic where we had lost so many tribal members, specifically elders. And my tribe was just in a really tough place. And here I am, I'm going to email my leadership and say, what do you want to do with the bodies of children? And so I'm sitting there writing this letter, and I knew it was important for me to give historical context to the issue at hand. And so one of the things that Eva Gugamos had researched and shared with me was that when they were building that school in the early 1800s, a Klamath tribal member died. His name was Cassius Brown. And at that time, the school said, it's too expensive to send these bodies home. We're no longer going to pay for it. We're just going to bury them on site. And so Cassius's family, when they found out that he had died, his brother rode a horse up from Chiloquin and rode all the way to Chemawa and paid to have that body returned. He then got on a train with the body and rode that train from Salem down to Ashland. He rented a wagon and rode it over, took it over the mountain pass, over the Rogue Valley Mountain Pass, and Cassius was buried in Beatty, Oregon. That round trip took about 2 months. And so I felt it was important that my leadership know that at the time, this was important, that these children be brought back home. And so I'm looking at the list of children, and there's, about 13 of them on there, a couple of Modocs, mostly Klamaths. And I see the name Charlie Feister. And Charlie Feister was 12. And most of these children are dying from things like tuberculosis and those sorts of things. And I see Charlie Feister died of a gunshot wound. And my heart just sinks. And it's not because I don't think that he would get shot running from that school. I know enough about boarding schools to believe that that could happen. I don't believe that they would put that down at the cause of death. I believe Charlie would go into an unmarked grave if that was the case. And I'm like, what happened that they're acknowledging that this 12-year-old was shot and killed while at boarding school? So I email another friend, and this friend's named Sue Ann. And Sue Ann happens to be really good with the U of O archives. The Ducks have that going for them. She busts into those U of O archives and finds this newspaper article. And I'm talking within a couple hours, she's emailing me back. And she said, what happened was that Charlie was running from Chemawa. It was his 4th time running away. And he was camped outside of Salem. And he needed supplies. They were hungry, him and a couple other boys. And so they broke into a store. And attached to the store was a post office. And up above was the post office master general. And he heard people breaking into his store. And he went down and he let off about 5 shots and shot and killed Charlie Feister. And I wasn't upset with the post office master general. You know, he was defending his premise. He didn't realize it was a young child. I was upset with an institution that was so bad that this 12-year-old was willing to run 250 miles and was on his 4th escape attempt. And nothing was being done about that institution. And so I'm writing to my counsel, and there had been so many tears throughout this project because you just get another punch in the gut every time you find something new. And so I'm writing the letter to counsel, and at the end I say, I can't say for certain that Charlie Feister was running home. I can tell you he didn't make it, and I can ask you if it's time to bring him home. And I knew I was dumping this on my people in a time when they were carrying so much. And I just started crying. And I called my cousin who had been by my side throughout this process. And my cousin Mandy, she works in the medical field. And I'm just crying and I'm telling her about Charlie. And she had some words of wisdom for me. She said, Abby, these boarding schools are like a wound. And we have done everything we can just to patch them up and make it through the day. Now it's time that we break that bone, we set it, and we heal it permanently. And I remember, I was like, wow, Mandy, you're really prophetic, because it made me feel better. But Native peoples refer to the boarding schools as a soul wound, because it's so deep, you just can't scrape the surface and fix it. And so now, this is what my tribe is dealing with. What do we do with those children? And Charlie, who we know was coming home and never made it. And how do we heal from this, generation after generation? And one of the ways we did that was by letting our elders tell us their stories and tell us their experiences. Because for so long, my grandma never told me about the boarding schools, never. And they just held that inside. And they held that shame and they held that hurt. And so one of the ways that we're trying to heal is by the truth part of getting the truth of their stories out. And one of the things we got to do with our Senate Bill 13 funding was we got to make a video. And this was made by a film company here in Bend called Wahoo Films. And this is the story of some of our elders and what they experienced in boarding school.
United States government opened Oregon's first Indian boarding school in 1880. For 100 years, the Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskan children were forced into boarding schools with the goal of assimilating Native Americans into mainstream society. The federal government forcefully took Indian children away from their families, tribes, and reservations in order to completely disconnect them from their culture and traditional ways of life. This led to generational trauma that can still be seen in Native communities today.
I was 8 years old. We drove on to Albany and we pulled up in front of this huge home, and my brother and I were both excited because they brought the suitcases out too, and they said, wow, maybe we're going to get to spend the night in this big house. Mom and Grandpa took us up, and one of the nuns took my hand and one of the nuns took my brother's hand, and Mom and Grandpa turned around, went down the stairs, never looked back, and my brother started crying and screaming, and down he went, said, shut up by the hair, and into the door. He was really emotional, and it took 3 or 4 slaps to shut him up and set him down, and that was a welcome to St. Mary's Academy in Albany, so it was traumatic to no end.
Upon arriving at the boarding schools, Native children had their hair cut, traditional clothing removed, and were punished for speaking their language or practicing their traditional ceremonies.
You spoke their language, they got in trouble, and there was this room. Well, actually, it was more like a closet that they put them in. She said it was just big enough for them to stand in. And they had to be in there hours on end without anything to eat, drink, restroom breaks, or anything until school felt they learned their lesson. And she told me, you don't want to learn that lesson, and it's better that you don't even learn our culture, because all it'll do is get you in trouble.
Our first grade teacher, Sister Grace, she was great. I loved her. Third and fourth grade teacher, Sister Veronica, she was a hitter. She pulled hair. She had a 12-inch ruler, the little metal thing on the end that she loved to hit you with. And I remember her slapping my brother in the face because he was a crier, and she slapped him. She'd break his glasses. She pulled his hair, and all I could do was sit because you did not dare make a noise.
Once an Indian child was in boarding school, only the government could determine when they would be discharged.
It was just before Christmas, and nothing had changed. And Sister Felicitas was on my brother, slapping him, had him on his knees, praying and slapping him at the same time. And he got a bloody nose, and I lost it. I jumped on her back, and she went down like a ton. The nuns wanted them to take us to jail. And whoever was in charge of the policeman came up and said, you are to take these 12-year-old kids back. And they took us down and put us on a train, and we were gone.
Although Clay and his brother made it home, the number of children who never came home is staggering. Many endured routine physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Some perished into unmarked graves, never to return home.
We're talking now about finding unmarked graves. They missed their children, and they were taken away forever. I don't know how a community recovers from that.
My brother never, ever recovered from that experience. He would not connect with an adult. He trusted no adults. And his feeling was that he was never loved, he was never wanted.
Survivors from boarding schools carried their trauma into adulthood as they became the aunts and the uncles, the parents and the grandparents. We call it salmoks to subsequent generations.
Outcomes from boarding school experiences, and they affected me. I had to learn to hug my daughter and to be affectionate, and with my children now, they're 30 and 33, and every time I see them, I try to get as many hugs as I can, and so we're trying to make up in our family for a lot of the traumas that we've had.
Our strength and resilience has sustained our communities through this turbulent time. We are now learning from the experiences that our elders have endured. We are learning how truly strong our ancestors were and are. We weep for who and what we've lost, but we celebrate those who came home and found the will and determination to give back to their families, communities, and tribe.
Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey, hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Remember me. When the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me.
So something that's important to remember is we are a small tribe. That list was gathered with myself and a clipboard and Cami Horton from OPB doing research in a 6-month period. The federal government contains no list of people that attended tribal boarding schools. They have bits and pieces here and there, but I can't say, oh, can I please get the list of Klamath tribal members who attended boarding school? Because that's what I thought when I started researching this project, is the information's there, I just have to find it. But it has been intentionally covered up. And so that list is what we were able to come up with. And believe me, we get, hey, you forgot Auntie, or how dare you forget Grandma? People tell us all the time that we've forgotten people off the list. But imagine what a list for some tribe like Navajo Nation looks like. We were a small tribe, and those are the people that were influenced by the boarding schools, that attended boarding schools. And something that's important is we got to hear the story of a survivor, Clay Dumont. And this is the picture that hangs outside the Klamath Tribe's education department there at our admin building. And when I called the boarding school healing coalition, they said, no, St. Mary's isn't a boarding school. I called the Oregon historical department. They said, no, you're wrong. You mean Chamawa. I said, no, I'm not wrong. I have a picture of little Indian kids sitting on the steps. I have the story of my elders. In the 2 years that we have been doing this research, we have found over 6 schools that are not being recognized as boarding schools, such as Canyonville Bible Academy, where my grandma attended, St. Mary's right here. There's St. Andrews, there's Sacred Heart in Klamath Falls. We just keep finding more and more schools that are not being recognized as part of this history, and they are. And so to have that history to this day continually denied, when we have the oral story that it happened and it existed, is still painful. One of the things I want to bring your attention to is this, where we date the schools back to 1819, but we saw that the mentality dated back to 1606, and it just became federal policy where they were federally funded in 1887. And I want to bring your attention to 1928. That was the very first comprehensive report on Indian affairs. It was a 1,400-page report that came out during John Collier kind of ushered it through, but it was during the FDR administration. And that report said exactly how bad these schools were. It outlined the physical, mental, and sexual abuse going on in the schools. And nothing was done through the 1960s and 70s. After the Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark case in 1954 that said segregated education is not in the best interest of the students, schools were desegregated except for Native American boarding schools. They still remain segregated. And within the last 5 years, more has happened with Indian boarding schools than in the past 50. And the sad thing that triggered this was they started finding mass unmarked graves in Canada. And so they would find graves of 300 children to 1,000 children to 600 children in unmarked graves at the former sites of schools. And the majority of them have come out of Canada, but it's because we're not looking in the United States. To date, they have found over 10,000 bodies of children in unmarked graves. They believe that over 40,000 died in North America attending these schools in the United States and Canada. And if you take nothing else from this presentation, take this flippin' mentality. These are not unmarked graves, they are crime scenes. This is a boarding school right over here, St. Francis. If we found a single body in that courtyard, it would be yellow taped and we would want to know what happened to that child. We can find 500 of them at a boarding school or a residential school, and it barely makes the news. And so I want that flippin' mentality and the loss of life to be viewed differently going forward. And it's starting to change here in the United States. The reason why I said more's been done is because for the first time our Secretary of Interior is an Indigenous woman. Her name is Deb Haaland, and her grandparents attended boarding schools. So she did the boarding school initiative, and she released part 1 of a report that brought up more information. And basically what it found was that there was an active cover-up we can't get all the information because it has been intentionally destroyed. And so the information that we do have is far more. This is what I used to use, saying there is 367 boarding schools. But what the newest report found is that there's over 408. And this still excludes at least the 6 that we've found in research in the last 2 years here in Oregon. So they don't really know what's out there. And as our elders continue to die off, that history continues to die off as well. But there have been some footsteps forward. And one is that the First Nations people and the residential schools in Canada, the Catholic Church was instrumental in running those along with the Crown. And so the Pope actually apologized. In April of 2022, a bunch of chiefs actually went to the Vatican City and were spoken to, received, and apologized to. And then later in July of that summer, he came to Indigenous land in Canada and apologized in person. And it's very easy to kind of get wrapped up in the trauma of the boarding schools. Believe me, that's there, and it manifests itself in our communities. But I never want people to overlook the strength and resilience. This right here, this is Selden Kirk. He was elected lifetime chairman of the Klamath Tribes. I was given this presentation about 2 years ago, and my dad was online, his first Zoom meeting ever. And he's watching it, and I made the comment that Joe Ball, he ran, but I don't know what happened to Joe Ball. And my dad said, well, the Sand Creek Station. You drive down Highway 97. Don't take your first cut off to Silver Lake. Take the second one where you go across the Klamath Marsh. Right before that turnoff is the Sand Creek Station. I don't know how Joe made it back, but he made it back, and he opened up the Sand Creek Station. So every time you drive by it, let it be a sign of Indigenous strength and resilience. And frequently when I do these talks, I'm asked, how can we be better allies? And you did it today. You showed up to acknowledge this history and to learn this history. And then to also support Natives who are reconnecting. Oregon is very uniquely situated, and not only do we have the boarding school history, but we also have termination, which was later legislation that was very damaging to the tribes in Oregon. And so Oregon has a lot of Natives who are trying to reconnect. And then to understand that we are trying to heal as well. And then if you had not heard about this history today, ask yourself why that is. And then the last thing I would ask of you is, I kind of feel like I just chucked a rock into the middle of the river. And it's up to you what that ripple effect is. So if you learn something new that you didn't know, ask why that is and then share it. Because part of our truth journey is the reconciliation and finding out why that is and what else we don't know. And the last thing I would say is on September 30th, we have our day of acknowledgement for boarding schools. And so on that day, we wear orange. And I always like to bring my Native people's attention to, we are the grandchildren of the Indians that they were unable to remove and of the survivors of these boarding schools. And lastly, my tribe specifically, we have the AMBO Fund. We are working to purchase back water and land in our community. And so we do river and water restoration with this fund and use it to purchase back our homelands, which we do not have. And then as we're also in the ceded territories of the Warm Springs, they have the Chush Fund. And this Chush Fund goes directly to getting them clean drinking water. And so if you want to take your allyship a step further, the AMBO Fund is, and it goes directly to the tribe so they can disperse it. And then lastly, support bills like Senate Bill 13, where we now teach Indigenous history. And these are the links there. And very last thing, self-promoting. But if you want to learn more about the Klamath tribes, there's a free event on March 20th. And it's going to be related towards environmental issues and current issues related to the Klamath tribes. And lastly, Moosop Ketcha, thank you so much for showing up and for the people who helped me research and write this presentation. I'm very thankful to the elders who still tell their stories. And that's how we're able to get the accurate history. And I also believe it's healing for them as well as for us, the listeners. It kind of just makes you realize how glad you are to have been a descendant and rather than a participant of this history. But thank you so much.